The security badge flashed red, my own face staring back from a in memoriam post. Sarah Johnson screamed and hurled her coffee mug like I was already a ghost. Guards slammed me into the carpet before I could grab the ledger, the one with my name on a $10 million payout. My boss wasn't shocked. He was counting the seconds until they dragged me out. I clawed at the desk, fingers brushing the paper that proved this wasn't a mistake. The guard's grip tightened. Too late, I realized. They weren't just firing me. They were burying me. The glass facade of Apex Global Logistics hummed with the vibration of passing freight trucks, smelling of burnt diesel and wet asphalt. Arthur Miller adjusted his tie, the silk frayed against his thumb. He reached into his pocket for his security badge, but his thumb brushed the cold screen of his phone instead. A notification light pulsed, a rhythmic, clinical blue. The LinkedIn feed scrolled under his touch. His own face stared back, framed by a soft focus filter he didn't remember choosing. Above the portrait, the text read, "In loving memory of Arthur Miller, a dedicated colleague." The blue like buttons multiplied beneath a string of digital prayers and folded hand emojis. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He glanced at the revolving doors where the security guard, a man named Gary, who usually shared baseball stats, now stared through the glass with narrowed eyes. Gary's hand hovered over his radio. A gust of wind whipped a discarded coffee cup across the pavement, the plastic lid scratching the concrete. Arthur tapped the screen, his finger trembling. The post listed his tenure, 15 years, and ended with a note about his sudden departure. He wasn't dead. He was standing 3 feet from the welcome mat, the morning sun stinging his eyes. "Morning, Gary," Arthur called out, his voice cracking. He stepped toward the sensor. The doors remained locked. Gary didn't wave. He didn't offer the score from last night's Yankees game. Instead, the guard stepped back, his mouth a grim line, and pulled a heavy curtain across the glass. Arthur stood paralyzed, his reflection superimposed over the digital ghost on his screen. The hum of the building shifted into a low, mechanical growl. Arthur pressed his badge against the black reader. Usually, the device emitted a cheerful, high-pitched chirp, and the magnetic locks clicked open with a satisfying thud. Today, the reader glowed a steady, angry red. It felt hot against the air. He swiped again, then a third time, the plastic card scraping against the sensor. 1, 2, 3. An odd number. He took a tiny shuffle step to his left to reset his internal count. "Gary, it's Arthur," he shouted, his breath fogging the glass. "The sensor is down. Open up." Inside the lobby, Gary didn't move. He picked up a desk phone, his eyes locked on Arthur with a mixture of fear and revulsion, as if he were looking at a car crash or a stain on the rug. Arthur watched Gary's lips move, but no sound pierced the thick, insulated glass. The world outside felt suddenly too loud. The screech of a bus's brakes, the distant wail of a siren, while the world inside Apex was a silent, sterile tomb. Arthur felt the first prickle of true panic, a cold sweat dampening the small of his back. He wasn't just locked out. He was being unhappened. He didn't wait for Gary to finish that phone call. Arthur knew the building's anatomy better than he knew his own wife's face. He turned and ran toward the loading docks, his dress shoes skidding on the oily pavement. He counted his strides. 22, 24, 26. He reached the service entrance, a heavy steel door tucked behind a dumpster that smelled of rotting cabbage and wet cardboard. He grabbed the handle and yanked. It was heavy, but it wasn't deadbolted. He slipped inside, the air suddenly smelling of ozone and industrial floor wax. He bypassed the elevators, knowing they'd be monitored. Instead, he hit the fire stairs. His lungs burned, the dry air of the stairwell tasting of concrete dust. 64, 66, 68 steps. He burst through the door onto the 4th floor, the bullpen. The office was a sea of white desks and humming computers. The smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air. He marched toward his cubicle, his eyes fixed on the framed photo of his dog, Buster, that sat next to his monitor. "Arthur?" The voice was a strangled gasp. Sarah Johnson stood by the communal printer, a stack of papers clutched to her chest. Her eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. She looked at Arthur, then at the phone in her hand, then back at Arthur. "Sarah, I need to talk to Sterling," Arthur said, his voice coming out in a ragged wheeze. "The system, it's got me listed as—" Sarah didn't let him finish. She let out a piercing, jagged shriek that cut through the low hum of the office like a saw. Her hand went to the heavy ceramic mug on the edge of her desk, a World's Best Analyst trophy. She hurled it. The mug whistled past Arthur's ear and shattered against the wall behind him. Shards of white clay sprayed his shoulder. "Stay away!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. She reached into her oversized cardigan and pulled out a small silver crucifix, holding it out like a shield. "You're dead. I saw the post. I saw the flowers." "Sarah, look at me. I'm breathing. I'm right here." The office erupted. People were standing up, chairs screeching against the carpet like wounded animals. The air grew thick with the sound of snapping plastic and frantic whispers. Arthur ignored them, lunging for Robert Sterling's office. He passed Sarah's desk and saw her apology log open. She was already scratching a line into the paper. Sorry to Arthur for him being dead. He didn't make it to the door. A shadow fell over him, smelling of peppermint and gun oil. A massive hand clamped onto Arthur's shoulder, the fingers digging into the muscle with the force of a vice. "That's enough, Mr. Miller." A low, rumbling voice vibrated through Arthur's spine. It was Michael Davis. The humming guard stood 6'4", his shaved head gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, James Wilson was already unholstering a can of pepper spray, his eyes darting toward the ceiling tiles. 12, 13, 14, James whispered under his breath. "Michael, listen to me," Arthur gasped, trying to twist away. "There's a mistake in the data. I'm standing right here." Michael didn't answer. He began to hum. It was a low, mournful tune, the funeral dirge from Tristan und Isolde. The vibration of the song traveled through Michael's chest and into Arthur's arm. "Secure the intruder," James barked, though his voice wavered. They tackled him. Arthur hit the carpet hard, the synthetic fibers scratching his cheek. The air was knocked out of him in a sickening whoomp. He was pinned, Michael's knee pressing into his lower back, the weight feeling like a mountain. His face was inches from Sterling's mahogany desk. He saw a stack of papers sitting on the edge, weighted down by a silver paperweight. The top sheet was a ledger. His eyes scanned the lines. Logistics training made him a master of the quick read. Policy number 8892-X. Beneficiary, Apex Global Logistics. Payout amount, $10 million. Status, pending death certificate verification. Arthur's heart stopped. $10 million. That was the price of his life. With a desperate animal grunt, Arthur lunged his hand forward. His fingers brushed the cold paper. He gripped the corner and yanked it toward him, stuffing the crumpled ledger into his inner jacket pocket, just as Michael's weight shifted to crush the breath from his lungs. "Get him up," a new voice commanded. The office went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of knuckles cracking. Robert Sterling stood in the doorway of his office, sliding his silver-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with his middle finger. He looked down at Arthur as if he were a leaky trash bag. "Robert," Arthur choked out, his face pressed into the carpet. Tell them I'm alive." Sterling leaned down, his face a mask of clinical indifference. He didn't look at Arthur's eyes. He looked at the space just above his head. "The records are quite clear, Arthur," Sterling said, his voice a smooth, terrifying silk. "You passed away peacefully in your sleep 2 days ago. Heart failure. Very tragic for a man of your age. I'm standing here. You're looking at me." Sterling straightened his tie. "I'm looking at a security breach. I'm looking at a ghost who doesn't know when to leave the stage." He turned to Michael. "Remove him. If he returns, use whatever force is necessary to maintain the integrity of our environment." Michael's humming grew louder, a deep, vibrating drone that filled Arthur's ears. They dragged him toward the freight elevator, his heels dragging across the carpet, leaving twin furrows in the fabric. The last thing Arthur saw before the metal doors hissed shut was Sarah Johnson, hunched over her notebook, her pen scratching frantically as she recorded another apology to the air. The city of Chicago didn't care if Arthur Miller was dead or alive. It only cared about the wind. A damp, bone-chilling gust tunneled through the skyscrapers, biting through Arthur's thin suit jacket. He walked with his head down, his hand pressed against the crumpled ledger in his pocket. It felt like a hot coal against his ribs. He needed a coffee. He needed to sit and think. He stepped into a small bodega on 5th Street, the bell above the door ringing with a tinny, annoying chime. The air inside smelled of stale cigarettes and floor cleaner. He grabbed a prepackaged sandwich and a bottle of water, his hands shaking so hard the plastic crinkled loudly. He approached the counter where a teenager with greasy hair and a vacant stare sat behind a plexiglass shield. "That'll be $8.50, the kid said. Arthur pulled out his leather wallet. He took out his Chase debit card, the blue one with the embossed silver letters. He swiped it. Declined. He frowned. "Try it again. There's $3,000 in that account." The kid swiped it again. A sharp, rhythmic beeping erupted from the register. The kid's eyes widened as he looked at the screen. "Hey, man," the kid said, his voice dropping an octave. "This card is flagged." "Flagged? For what?" "It says, 'Deceased owner. Confiscate and notify authorities.'" The kid didn't hand the card back. He dropped it into a slot beneath the register and reached for the phone. Arthur didn't wait. He bolted. He ran 3 blocks to his apartment building, a brick mid-rise with a flickering neon sign. He needed his passport. He needed the birth certificate he kept in the metal lockbox under his bed. He reached the front steps and stopped. The sidewalk was covered in black plastic bags. A familiar plaid armchair sat lopsided on the curb, one leg missing. Beside it, a stack of cardboard boxes overflowed with his books, his clothes, his life. "Mrs. Gable," Arthur shouted, looking up at the second-floor window. The window creaked open. His landlord, a woman who smelled of lavender and mothballs, leaned out. She held a heavy set of keys in her hand. "You can't be here," she shrieked, her voice trembling. "The lawyers came. They showed me the papers. The estate is settled, Arthur. I've already rented the unit to a nice young couple from the suburbs. It's me. I'm standing right here, Mrs. Gable." "Go away, spirit," she cried, and slammed the window shut. Arthur collapsed onto the curb, his fingers digging into the fabric of his discarded winter coat. He began to claw through the trash bags, looking for the lockbox. The smell of wet wool and old paper filled his nose. He found a folder of old tax returns. He found a photo of his father's truck, but the lockbox was gone. A low mechanical growl rumbled at the end of the alley. Arthur looked up. A black SUV with tinted windows sat idling 20 yards away. The engine sounded like a predator purring. There were no license plates. The vehicle lurched forward. Arthur didn't think. He dove. He rolled behind a heavy steel dumpster just as the SUV's bumper slammed into the brick wall where he'd been standing a second before. The sound of metal on masonry was like a gunshot. Dust and grit rained down on his head. The SUV backed up, its tires screeching on the wet asphalt. It was repositioning for another strike. Arthur scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward the mouth of the subway. He could hear the heavy thud-thud of the tracks vibrating through the sidewalk. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3, 6, 9. He corrected with a frantic shuffle. 10. The subway station was a chaotic blur of gray coats and rushing bodies. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and damp humanity. Arthur vaulted the turnstile, ignoring the shout of the booth attendant. An express train was pulling in, its headlights cutting through the gloom of the tunnel like the eyes of a monster. The screech of metal on metal was deafening. Arthur looked back. A man in a dark suit was descending the stairs. He wasn't running. He was moving with a terrifying, predatory grace. On his lapel, a silver pin glinted, the Apex Global logo. The train doors hissed open. Arthur lunged inside, but as the doors began to close, a hand jammed between them. The hitman forced his way into the car. He was lean, with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. He didn't say a word. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket, the blade flicking open with a clinical snick. The other commuters moved away, creating a ring of empty space around them. No one helped. No one looked. "I'm not dead," Arthur whispered, backing away until his spine hit the emergency door at the end of the car. The hitman lunged. Arthur swung his heavy leather briefcase, the corner catching the man in the temple. The hitman grunted, his head snapping back, but he didn't stop. He slashed forward, the blade slicing through the sleeve of Arthur's jacket, drawing a thin line of heat across his forearm. Arthur kicked out, his heel catching the man in the chest. Through the window of the door, he saw the tunnel lights flashing by, a rhythmic, strobe-like blur. They were approaching a sharp curve. The train bucked. The hitman lost his footing for a split second. Arthur grabbed the emergency handle and yanked. The door hissed open, the roar of the wind and the screech of the tracks filling the car. They were on the coupling, the narrow metal bridge between two cars. The air was a freezing vortex of dust and iron filings. The hitman lunged again, pinning Arthur against the safety railing. The man's face was inches from his breath smelling of bitter almonds. "You're a ghost, Miller," the hitman hissed over the roar of the train. "Time to go back to the grave." Arthur saw the hitman's security badge dangling from a lanyard around his neck. It was gold, executive level. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Arthur grabbed the lanyard and twisted. He shoved his shoulder into the hitman's chest, using the train's momentum as it hit the curve. The hitman's eyes went wide. His grip on the knife loosened. Arthur gave one final, desperate shove. The man fell backward, his body disappearing into the black maw of the tunnel. There was no scream, only the sound of a heavy weight hitting the concrete walls. Arthur slumped against the door, gasping for air. In his hand, he clutched the gold security badge. He looked at the name printed on it. Internal Security. Clearance, Vanderbilt. Catherine Vanderbilt, the CEO. The realization hit him harder than the hitman's fist. This wasn't just Sterling's petty greed. This was the head of the snake. He wasn't just a victim of a mistake. He was a strategic liquidation. Arthur spent the night in a 24-hour public library, hiding in the back of the genealogy section where the air smelled of rotting paper and silence. He used a guest computer, his fingers flying across the keys. He cross-referenced the ledger he'd stolen with Apex's public filings. He wasn't a logistics analyst for nothing. He saw the patterns. He saw the ghost shipments. Billions of dollars in grain and oil that existed only on paper, moving through accounts that didn't have names, only numbers. The company was hollow. A billion-dollar shell. And his death was the first brick in a wall of fraudulent insurance claims designed to plug the hole before the European merger went through. "I need a lawyer," he whispered to the empty room. He found a name in a crumpled legal aid flyer. Thomas Reed, specializing in corporate malpractice and civil rights. The office was located in a part of Chicago where the streetlights were all broken and the air tasted of coal smoke. Arthur climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the 3rd floor. The door read, "Thomas Reed, attorney at law and reflection." Arthur knocked. The man who opened the door was a wreck. Thomas Reed smelled of stale bourbon and cheap cigarettes. His tie was stained with something yellow, and his hands shook as he adjusted his glasses. "I'm dead," Arthur said, stepping into the room. Reed didn't blink. He looked at Arthur's reflection in the polished glass of his desk. "Join the club, pal. I've been dead since '98. Arthur laid the ledger and the gold security badge on the desk. He told him everything: the LinkedIn post, the SUV, the hitman on the train. As Arthur spoke, a change came over Reed. The lethargy left his limbs. He leaned forward, his eyes tracking the numbers on the ledger with a predatory sharpness. "This is it," Reed whispered, his voice cracking. "This is the smoking gun. If we file an emergency injunction today, we can freeze the payout. We can force a physical identity verification in front of a judge." Arthur felt a wave of relief so intense it made his knees weak. "You can do that? You can bring me back? I can do more than that, kid. I can make them pay for every second you spent in the dark." Reed reached out and touched Arthur's hand. His skin felt like old parchment, but his grip was firm. "I've got you, I promise." Subverted beat 3.1. Arthur watched as Thomas Reed began to type. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the old mechanical keyboard felt like a heartbeat. Reed was efficient, his fingers moving with a grace that belied his disheveled appearance. He explained the legal strategy: a writ of habeas corpus applied to a civil identity, combined with a whistleblower protection filing. It was brilliant. It was the exact kind of high-level maneuvering Arthur had prayed for. "This ledger," Reed said, tapping the paper. "It's the key. Without this, they can claim you're just a disgruntled former employee with a mental break. With it, you're the man who knows where the bodies are buried." Reed looked up and smiled. It was a warm, weary smile that reached his tired eyes. "You did good, Arthur. You survived. Most people would have folded by the first afternoon. You're stronger than you look." Arthur felt the tension that had been coiled in his chest for 48 hours finally begin to unfurl. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked around the dusty office, the stacks of files, the flickering lamp, the smell of old coffee. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary. He was going to get his life back. He was going to see the sun tomorrow as a living man. He reached out and squeezed Reed's shoulder. "Thank you, Thomas. Truly." Reed nodded, his expression softening. "Don't mention it. Now, why don't you go into the back room? There's a sofa and some water. I need to finish these filings and call the clerk of the court. We'll move as soon as the sun comes up." Arthur walked into the small back office. He sat on the cracked leather sofa and closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the world lifting. He began to count his breaths, but for the first time in years, he didn't care if he landed on an odd number. He drifted into a light, peaceful sleep, the sound of Reed's typing acting as a lullaby. He woke up 20 minutes later to the sound of a car door slamming. It was too heavy for a sedan. It was the solid, pressurized thud of an armored SUV. Arthur sat up, his skin prickling. He crept to the door and peered through the crack. Thomas Reed wasn't typing anymore. He was standing by the window, his back to the room. He was holding his dead wife's grocery list, his fingers tracing the words milk, eggs, flour over and over again. The front door of the office opened without a knock. Catherine Vanderbilt walked in. She was a vision of ice and silk. Her white hair was a sharp blade against her neck, and her navy suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. Behind her stood Dr. Stephen Miller, clutching a black medical bag, and 2 guards Arthur recognized from the lobby. "Is it done?" Vanderbilt asked. Her voice was a low, freezing hum. Reed didn't turn around. "He's in the back. He gave me the ledger. It's on the desk." Arthur's heart dropped into his stomach. The world tilted. He looked at the desk. The ledger, his only proof, his only shield, was sitting right next to Vanderbilt's hand. "You did the right thing, Thomas," Vanderbilt said. She picked up the ledger and handed it to one of the guards. "The firm appreciates your consulting services. Your debt is cleared." Reed finally turned. He didn't look at Arthur's hiding spot. He looked at his own reflection in the window. "I needed the money, Arthur," he whispered, though he knew Arthur could hear him. "Everyone has a price. You just didn't know yours yet." The betrayal was a physical blow. Arthur felt his lungs seize. He had handed the only evidence of his existence to the people trying to erase him. He had walked right into the slaughterhouse and thanked the butcher for the tour. "Bring him out," Vanderbilt commanded. The guards kicked in the door to the back room. Arthur tried to fight, but he was exhausted and broken. They dragged him into the main office and threw him onto the floor at Vanderbilt's feet. She looked down at him, her face devoid of any emotion. She didn't see a man. She saw a decimal point that needed to be rounded down to 0. "Dr. Miller," she said. The medical examiner stepped forward. He smelled of formaldehyde and peppermint. He didn't look at Arthur either. He opened his bag and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Arthur Miller," the doctor said, his voice flat and clinical. "Patient exhibits extreme paranoid delusions. Claims to be a deceased individual. Found wandering the streets in a state of psychosis. I am hereby certifying him as a danger to himself and others." He signed the paper with a flourish. "There," Vanderbilt said, the silk of her scarf shimmering as she adjusted the knot. "You aren't a man anymore, Arthur. You're a medical file, and files can be lost." They dragged him out of the office, his feet kicking uselessly against the stairs. They didn't take him to a hospital. They took him down, deep into the bowels of the building, to a room where the walls were weeping concrete and the only light was a single, flickering bulb. They threw him into a cell and slammed the heavy iron door. Arthur sat in the dark, the smell of damp earth filling his lungs. He reached into his pocket and found a single, forgotten sugar packet from the library cafe. He gripped it until the paper crinkled. He was dead. And this time, there was no LinkedIn post to prove he'd ever existed at all. The basement of the law clinic was a tomb of forgotten things. Rusty pipes hissed overhead, dripping oily water onto the cracked floor. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline. Arthur sat on a wooden chair, his hands cuffed behind his back. The metal bit into his wrists, cold and unforgiving. A guard stood in the doorway, a silenced pistol hanging at his side. He was checking his watch, an expensive gold-plated thing that caught the light of the flickering bulb. 5 minutes, the guard said. Then we start the fire. Tragic accident. Squatter caught in a blaze. Clean. Simple. Arthur didn't say anything. He was looking at his hands. His years in logistics had taught him one thing. Everything is a tool if you know how it moves. He felt the small, thin metal strip tucked into the seam of his sleeve. A shipping shim he'd picked up from the loading dock floor days ago. It was no thicker than a fingernail, but it was hardened steel. He began to work. He didn't look at the guard. He focused on the sensation of the metal against the lock's tumblers. Click, click, click. The guard turned his back to adjust a gasoline canister. Click. The cuffs fell open. Arthur didn't move. He kept his hands behind his back, waiting. The guard stepped forward, unscrewing the cap of the gas can. The sharp, pungent scent of fuel filled the room. "Nothing personal, Miller," the guard said. "You're just bad for business." Arthur lunged. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the overhead pipe, the one marked with a red stripe. The fire suppressant line. He swung his weight, kicking the valve with all his might. The pipe burst. A high-pressure torrent of chemical foam and water exploded into the room, a white, blinding fog that hissed like 1,000 snakes. The guard screamed, blinded by the spray. He fired blindly, the muffled thwip-thwip of the silenced pistol hitting the concrete. Arthur dove through the fog. He knew the layout of these old buildings. The trash chute was always next to the service elevator. He found the hatch. It was small, smelling of rot and old grease. He didn't hesitate. He dived in. He slid down the metal tube, the darkness swallowing him. He hit a pile of soft, stinking bags at the bottom, the impact jarring his teeth. He scrambled out into the alley, his clothes soaked in foam and filth. He was alive. But he wasn't Arthur Miller anymore. Arthur Miller was the man who followed the rules. Arthur Miller was the man who counted his steps. He looked at his reflection in a puddle of oily water. His hair was matted, his face smeared with soot. He looked like a ghost. So he decided to act like one. The Apex Global Gala was a sea of black ties and diamond necklaces. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt smelled of lilies and expensive perfume, the scent of a high-end funeral. Catherine Vanderbilt stood on the stage, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was smiling, her white hair glowing under the spotlights. "To the future," she said into the microphone, "to a world of seamless transitions and perfect data." The crowd cheered. Arthur moved through the shadows at the back of the room. He was wearing a waiter's jacket he'd stolen from the locker room, the white fabric stained with a single drop of grease. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a ledger. He had his own body. He stepped onto the stage. The music died. The guests froze, their glasses halfway to their lips. Vanderbilt turned, her smile faltering. "Who are you?" "Security." Arthur didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver letter opener he'd taken from the lobby desk. The crowd gasped. Vanderbilt backed away, her face pale. "I'm not here to kill you, Catherine," Arthur said. His voice was loud, echoing through the silent hall. "I'm here to prove I'm real." He gripped the blade and sliced a deep, jagged line across his own palm. The blood was bright, shocking red. It spilled over his hand, dripping onto the pristine white marble of the stage. He stepped forward and grabbed Vanderbilt's arm. He smeared the blood across her white silk gown, leaving a horrific crimson stain. "Look at it," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with 3 days of repressed rage. "A ghost doesn't bleed. A digital entry doesn't have a heart. I am Arthur Miller, and I am standing right here." The cameras, the ones live streaming the gala to the European investors, caught every second of it. They caught the terror in Vanderbilt's eyes. They caught the blood. And then they caught the sound of the sirens. The aftermath was a blur of blue lights and cold coffee. The FBI didn't care about LinkedIn posts. They cared about the dead man's trigger Arthur had uncovered, the way the insurance payouts were linked to the embezzlement accounts. Once they started pulling the thread, the whole tapestry unraveled. Vanderbilt was led out in handcuffs, her white hair disheveled, her silk gown ruined by the red stain. Sterling followed, his knuckles raw from cracking them in the back of a squad car. Arthur sat in the empty Apex bullpen, the sun beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline. The office was quiet. No humming computers, no screaming colleagues. He looked at his desk. Someone had put a small vase of lilies there. A memorial. He picked up the vase and threw it into the trash. Subverted beat 4.4. 2 weeks later, Arthur sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room. Across from him sat a phalanx of lawyers in gray suits. "Mr. Miller," the lead attorney said, pushing a thick stack of papers across the table. "The settlement offer is unprecedented. $5 million. In exchange, you sign a total non-disclosure agreement. You forfeit all future claims against the estate of Apex Global. And for the sake of the ongoing federal investigation into the insurance industry, you agree to a legal name change. A fresh start? A witness protection protocol without the government oversight." Arthur looked at the check. $5 million. It was more money than he would have earned in 3 lifetimes of logistics work. It was his pension, his house, his security, all wrapped up in a single piece of paper. He picked up the pen. He thought about his father's truck. He thought about the odd numbers. He signed. The lawyer smiled, a cold, professional expression. "Congratulations, Mr. Shaw, Artie Shaw. Your new identity papers are in the envelope. Your social security number is active. Your credit score is perfect. You are a brand new man." Arthur, Artie, walked out of the building. He went to his car, a modest sedan he'd bought with the first installment of the settlement. He drove toward the highway, heading west. He stopped at a diner in Iowa, the air smelling of fried onions and diesel. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee. "Name for the tab?" the waitress asked, her pen poised over a pad. Arthur opened his mouth to say his name. He stopped. He realized he didn't know which one to say. Arthur Miller was dead. The world believed it. His friends had mourned him. His wife, the woman who hadn't even called when the news broke, had already moved on. Artie Shaw was a line of code. He was a settlement. He was a ghost created by a committee of lawyers to hide a corporate sin. He looked at his hands. The scar on his palm was a thick, angry purple. It was the only thing about him that felt real. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. 12:01. An odd number. He didn't take a shuffle step. He didn't count his breaths. He realized with a sickening, hollow thud in his chest that he had won the war but lost the territory. He had his money. He had his safety. But he had no history. He had no parents, no childhood, no 30 years of hard work. It had all been traded for a check and a clean slate. He was free from the system, but he was also invisible to it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single packet of sugar. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took out a small leather notebook and wrote, Day 1. Somewhere, IA. He tucked the sugar into the book. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a remainder. A decimal point that had been moved so many times, it no longer knew where the original number started. He paid for his coffee with cash, crisp, new bills that smelled of nothing, and walked back to his car. The horizon was a flat, terrifying line. He started the engine and drove into the sunset. A man with $5 million and no soul, disappearing into the vast, empty heart of a country that had already forgotten he ever existed. The end.